In 14th century France, power meant survival, and survival meant arranging your daughter's wedding before she could pronounce her own last name. King Charles VI of France, Isabel's father, was already descending into madness. Some say he believed he was made of glass. Others say he screamed about invisible enemies. Either way, his throne was no longer his. It was a seat haunted by vultures, and his queen, Isabeau of Bavaria, was no savior. She didn't cry when our daughter, was betrothed. She celebrated, because in royal politics, a daughter is currency, and a 6-year-old bride, that's a blank slate, an empty vessel to be molded, controlled, and owned. Think about that. Not protected, owned. They didn't just trade Isabel for peace. They manufactured peace through trauma. Grooming wasn't a side effect. It was the strategy. Now listen carefully. What we call cruelty today was called strategy back then. But here's the twist. That mentality didn't vanish with the monarchy. It mutated. It bled into boardrooms, into schools, into media, into every system designed to shape your identity without you noticing. Because the goal has always been the same. Control the young, and you control the future. Isabel was just the beginning. They called it a truce, but it was a sacrifice, an offering of flesh to feed the hunger of nations. In 1396, France and England stood on the edge of collapse, drained by endless war. Armies were dying, but so were dynasties. And so, the elders gathered, not in secret, but in the open halls of palaces, under painted ceilings and stained glass. They sat at long tables and bartered over the body of a child. The English king needed stability. The French crown needed peace. The solution? A little girl named Isabel. Her value wasn't her soul, her mind, her laughter. It was her womb, her symbolic purity, her ability to be shaped by a man nearly 5 times her age. The English diplomats initially hesitated. Even they flinched at her age. But the French court, masters of political perversion, reassured them. She will grow into him, they said. She will learn to please. The words were spoken with smiles. Polished boots shifted beneath tables while the ink dried on the contract. The disturbing truth is this. The marriage wasn't postponed until she came of age. It began immediately. The clauses spelled it out. Richard II could control every part of her life, where she slept, who she saw, what language she spoke. It was a calculated erasure. They weren't just stealing her childhood. They were manufacturing obedience. Do you see the shape of it now? This wasn't an anomaly. This was a system, a template. And once you understand the template, you start seeing the echoes of it today. In industries, in institutions, in screens that raise your children while you're too tired to ask why. The most horrifying part, she didn't even understand. When they told her she'd be Queen of England, Isabel's first question wasn't about power or responsibility or destiny. She asked if she could bring her dolls. Her dolls. Because despite the crown, the dress, the jewels, she was still a child. Still believed in comfort, in magic, in bedtime stories. But her story had already been written, not in ink, but in blood. Imagine it. She's surrounded by adults who smile too hard and talk too fast. She's told to wave, to curtsy, to rehearse a wedding vow she can't pronounce. And all around her, courtiers clap, poets write verses, diplomats drink to peace, but no one sees her. Not truly. Because to see her fear, her confusion, her innocence, would ruin the illusion. And power hates clarity, so they buried her emotions under silk and ceremony. They covered her fear with garlands and gold thread. It's the same tactic used today. Dress up the lie, hide the trauma behind prestige, but the child always remembers. Trauma leaves a taste in the bones. Isabel would carry that taste with her into a foreign land, into a foreign bed, into the cold silence of Westminster Palace. But before we go there, I need to warn you. What comes next isn't history. It's a mirror. And if you're not ready to see your own reflection in it, turn back now. The day she left France, the sky wept. That's what the records say. That the clouds broke open like a divine warning, but no one listened. Not the nobles, not the priests, not even her mother, who watched from the balcony like a merchant shipping off delicate goods. Isabel was 6 years old, and she was being led through the gates of the Louvre like a lamb, except this was no sacrifice to God. It was to empire. Her father, King Charles VI, broke through his fog of madness just long enough to embrace her. He whispered something into her ear, words so haunting, so personal, that she collapsed into tears. Then the guards had to peel her from his arms. The scribes wrote it down. She screamed for her father until her voice gave out. That's how royalty said goodbye. With desperation, with silence, with ghosts trailing every step of the procession. The journey from Paris to the English port was a 2-week parade of forced smiles. Every town was ordered to rejoice. Flags waved, musicians played, acrobats danced in the mud, all for a child who couldn't stop crying. She clutched a wooden doll so tightly that by the time they reached Calais, the paint had rubbed off and her fingers were raw. She was marched into a pavilion like a hostage. The English stood in rows dressed like conquerors, pretending to be saviors. They inspected her, like livestock, teeth, posture, hair, her size. One English lord was heard whispering that she would ripen beautifully. She was 6, and nobody objected. What happened next wasn't a wedding. It was a transfer of ownership. French nobles led her to the center of a field, where English officials waited with documents and gold. Latin was spoken, contracts were signed, and in that moment, she became property. Not a princess, not a person. A pawn with a heartbeat. You feel sick, don't you? You should, because this wasn't an accident. This wasn't the wow 8 things were. This was deliberate, designed, approved. And here's the part that should haunt you. These systems of control didn't disappear. They just changed clothes. They moved from thrones to boardrooms, from palaces to algorithms. And their targets? Still the young, still the powerless, still those too innocent to fight back. They told her it was a celebration. But the moment Isabel crossed into English hands, the celebration ended for her. The English stripped away her French attendants, even her beloved governess, who had raised her since birth. Gone, sent back across the channel like unwanted baggage. The women who replaced them didn't speak her language. She couldn't understand their orders, couldn't cry in words they would comprehend. Even her dog, the tiny companion promised to her for comfort, was taken away. Richard didn't like small dogs. That was the reason. And in its place, silence. Foreign faces. A bed that smelled of lavender and power. And the steady, invisible pressure of obedience. The journey to London blurred into a nightmare carousel of pageantry. Every town was ordered to celebrate their new child queen. Bells rang. Children were pushed into crowds to cheer. But to Isabel, it felt like death. She later confessed to a priest that she thought they were preparing her for execution. And in a way, they were. Not of her body, but of her identity. The slow suffocation of self that begins when the world no longer allows you to choose even your thoughts. When they reached London, it was a spectacle only tyranny could fund. Westminster dripped in gold. Banners of France and England, stitched together like a forced marriage, hung from every tower. Thousands watched, cheering, pointing, smiling. But when Isabel stepped out, The crowd gasped, not in awe, in horror. She was so small, so fragile, so visibly wrong for what was about to happen. Her wedding robes had to be held up by 2 attendants. The crown slipped down her brow. The rings didn't fit her fingers. This wasn't sacred union. It was theater, a grotesque ritual dressed in incense and illusion. And Richard II, he didn't hesitate. His face showed no guilt. His gaze wasn't that of a husband. It was that of a man finalizing a transaction. His worries weren't for her safety or her soul. They were political. Would this marriage buy him the time he needed? Would it stop his enemies from circling? Would the French gold arrive on schedule? To him, Isabel was leverage, a solution, an asset. And that's the truth no one told you about royal marriages. They weren't built on love. They were built on strategy. And strategy always demands a sacrifice. The ceremony began with a lie and ended in a sentence. Latin chants filled the cathedral like smoke, obscuring the horror from those too comfortable to see it. Priests muttered blessings over something they should have condemned. They called it holy matrimony. But what happened that day in 1396 was not sacred. It was sanctioned possession, a ritual of control so old, so refined, it masked itself as divine will. Isabel stood there, trembling, her body lost in the folds of imported silk, her crown tilted like it was mocking her. She couldn't even hold the ceremonial orb. Her arms weren't strong enough. And yet they forced her to swear allegiance, to vow loyalty, to bind her life to a man she couldn't understand, in a language she couldn't speak, inside a country she didn't choose. She was 6 years old, and Richard, 29. A man not only fully grown, but fully aware, fully complicit, fully sovereign. He looked at her not with love, but calculation. Every step of this union had been designed to ensure his dominance. The contract even spelled it out. While consummation would wait until she was of suitable age, all other rites of marriage applied immediately. Let that settle in your mind. A grown man was legally entitled to absolute control over a 6-year-old girl, because the church and state both nodded. That is not history. That is design. And the designers were not just kings. They were councils, bishops, bloodlines. They understood something that modern minds forget. If you control the child, you control the lineage. You control the future. And they weren't about to let that power slip through their fingers. So they smiled. They clapped. They told themselves it was duty, that it was for peace, for legacy, for divine order. But under the marble arches and golden banners, something ancient stirred. Not love, not faith, but something older. A shadow that speaks in contracts and whispers through veils. The same force that shapes governments today, that designs school systems, that programs your feed. It doesn't scream, it whispers. This is normal. But it's not, and you know it. If you're still watching, you've already started to feel it. The fracture. The sense that something is wrong, not just then, but now. The same blueprint is being followed, just modernized, sanitized, marketed. And the product? You. Your attention. Your obedience. Your children. After the ceremony, they paraded her through the streets like a trophy. The child queen, trembling beneath a mountain of velvet and lace, while crowds chanted her name as if she were a savior. But she wasn't a savior. She was a symbol of alliance, of conquest, of obedience wrapped in a crown. They say she smiled. Of course she did. She was 6. Children smile when they're told to, when the alternative is punishment or confusion or silence. But witnesses noted something else. Her eyes, hollow, glazed, not with wonder, but with shock. The beginning of dissociation. And that's the part you're not supposed to understand. This story is not about one little girl in a gilded cage. This story is about how systems are designed to break the will early. Isabel wasn't just taken from her home, her language, her caretakers. She was severed from her reality, from herself. And in its place, they installed expectation, doctrine, ritual. She became not a person, but a role. This is how monarchies are built, but more importantly, it's how every modern institution was shaped, not to serve humanity, but to control it. You see it now, don't you? Education systems that don't teach truth but obedience. Media designed not to inform, but to distract. Workplaces that drain your life while calling it progress. It all begins with the same principle. Sever the child from their inner voice. Replace it with hierarchy, with rules, with reward systems based on pleasing authority. Isabel's fate may seem far from yours, but it's not. The only difference is scale and spectacle, but the blueprint, identical. And here's the part they don't want you to hear. Trauma isn't just a byproduct. It's a tool, a feature, because traumatized people are easier to mold, easier to sell to, easier to lead into war, into debt, into silence. Isabel's tears in the cathedral weren't a tragedy. They were part of the design. The architects of history didn't want her strength. They wanted her silence. Now lean in. This is where it turns. Because if you're still here, still watching, still breathing, then the spell is already breaking. The illusion is cracking, and I want you to do something dangerous. I want you to comment the phrase, "I see the crown in the cage." Comment it twice. Once for the girl who never escaped, and once for the version of yourself that's about to. They say she adjusted. That's how the records phrase it, adjusted, as if trauma is a pair of shoes you eventually grow into, as if a stolen childhood can be repaired with pearls and polite applause. In the months following her arrival, Isabel was groomed not just in manners, but in submission. She was surrounded by tutors who corrected her voice, her posture, her every instinct. She was forbidden to speak French. Her letters were intercepted. Her games were monitored. Her emotions contained. They didn't want her to grow. They wanted her to transform. Into what? A tool, a vessel, a walking treaty wrapped in silk. Richard II would visit her chambers often, not to harm her physically, not yet, but to begin the process of psychological ownership. He'd sit beside her bed. He'd tell her stories. He'd hold her hand until she stopped trembling. To outsiders, this was tenderness. To the architects of monarchy, it was programming, conditioning, and it worked. She began to smile more, curtsy better, parrot his words back to him in broken English. But make no mistake, this wasn't love. It was colonization, not of land, but of mind. A silent war waged between her memories of home and the commands of her captor. And this kind of war, you don't need swords for it, you only need time. This is the cruelty no one writes into the textbooks. That submission, when repeated enough, begins to feel like safety. That domination, when dressed as protection, can become comfort. It's why so many never escape the systems that trap them. Because eventually the bars feel like walls. The silence feels like peace, and the pain starts to sound like purpose. Isabel became a queen in title, but she remained a child in chains. Her image was printed on coins, her smile etched into woodcuts and frescoes, but none of it belonged to her. Even her face was property now, a national symbol, a convenient ficti. And that fiction, let me be very clear, is the foundation of every control system still operating today. Strip identity, reforge obedience, reward silence. From ancient cathedrals to corporate offices, the tools haven't changed. Only the stage has. By the time she turned 7, Isabel no longer asked to go home. That's how they knew the programming was working. She stopped speaking French entirely, not because she forgot it. No, language doesn't die that easily, but because it made the maids flinch, because it brought silence to the halls, because it reminded her of who she used to be. And memory, in systems of domination, is the first enemy. Strip the past, and you own the present. Own the present, and the future obeys without question. This wasn't an isolated case. This was a perfected ritual. Across the courts of Europe, this model was being replicated in real time. Child brides turned into currency. Alliances forged with innocent blood. Monarchs exchanged their children like playing cards, locking nations into decades of peace or war, depending on whose daughter survived childbirth. But Isabel's case stands out. Why? Because the paper trail is too detailed to ignore. Because her story reveals the full machinery of elite psychological engineering. What Richard and his court did was not criminal in their time. It was admired, documented, praised in poems, rewarded by bishops. They didn't just legalize abuse, they elevated it to royal strategy. A reminder that power doesn't just survive through violence. It thrives on ritualized submission. When the church blessed the marriage, they weren't just sanctifying a bond, they were sanctifying control. And they passed that blessing down the centuries, into law, into education, into morality itself. Let's be brutally honest. The same system that raised Isabel now wears modern clothes. It speaks through your institutions. It's coded into the software you use. It whispers through political speeches, school curriculums, job contracts. It doesn't need a crown anymore. It just needs your silence. And here's the most dangerous truth of all. Most people prefer the cage because it's padded with comfort, lined with just enough praise, filled with distractions. It keeps them from asking why they feel so empty, so replaceable, so invisible. But not you. You're still watching, which means you're starting to feel it. That flicker. That pressure in your chest that says, this is not how it was meant to be. You're not wrong, and you're not alone. Say it again in the comments. I see the crown in the cage. That phrase is not for the algorithm. It's for you, a trigger, a signal that the spell is breaking. You're beginning to see it now, aren't you? The architecture beneath the architecture. The blueprint behind the bloodlines. This wasn't about peace. It was about obedience. About locking a child into a narrative so scripted, so sanitized, that she couldn't tell where her will ended and the crowns began. But the machine doesn't stop with monarchies. It mutates. Centuries later, the same psychological mechanisms used on Isabel were perfected on millions. In schools that teach compliance, over curiosity. In corporate hierarchies that reward silence. In social contracts that punish the questioner and elevate the obedient. Think about how early they begin shaping you. Sit still. Repeat after me. Raise your hand for permission. Memorize, don't question. Learn the flag, the pledge, the anthem. Smile when you don't mean it. Wear the uniform. Accept the grade. Apologize when your truth makes others uncomfortable. You think you've escaped royalty? No. You've just inherited their tools. Every system of mass control begins the same way. Erase identity, then rebuild it in the image of the state, the church, the brand, the algorithm. They don't want your freedom. They want your programming. Because a programmed mind doesn't rebel. It doesn't ask why a 6-year-old girl must become a queen. It doesn't ask why millions suffer in silence today. It doesn't ask anything. Isabel didn't just lose her freedom. She became an instrument of her captor's stability. Her presence at Richard's side calmed the court, silenced rebellion, symbolized alliance. And what did she get in return? Applause, dresses, an illusion of reverence. But behind closed doors, she was isolated, monitored, reshaped. They called it nobility, but it was re-education. And here's where it sharpens, because you've been through it too, just more subtly. You were told what success looks like, what love is supposed to feel like, what to buy, how to look, who to follow. You weren't taught to be sovereign. You were taught to serve an image, serve a system, serve a narrative. But sovereignty isn't given. It's remembered, unburied, ripped from the jaws of comfort and illusion. You're not watching this by accident. You're waking up because the disguise is cracking. The rituals are failing. The crown is slipping. And the real question now is this: are you ready to remember who you were before the programming began? Let's go deeper now, into the silence no one dared to archive. The years that followed Isabel's wedding were deliberately buried under ceremony, but if you read between the lines of royal correspondence, you begin to see the fractures. She wasn't growing, literally. The English court doctors noted it with concern. Her appetite vanished. Her health deteriorated. The same child who once played with dolls now stared out palace windows for hours, silent, unmoving, unreachable. The truth? Trauma stunts more than just emotion. It can strangle the body too. Richard II, meanwhile, was unraveling. The peace he'd bought with her body wasn't holding. His enemies, many of them appalled that he'd married a child, began to circle. He grew paranoid, obsessed with loyalty. And who did he keep closest? Isabel, not out of affection, but as a shield. She became his mascot, his hostage, his symbol of divine right. He paraded her before the people, not because they loved her, but because he needed their fear of disobedience. If they questioned the queen, they questioned the crown. And if they questioned the crown, they were crushed. That's how tyranny survives. It wraps itself in innocence, then dares you to speak against it. They still do it. In your country, in your politics, in your media. Think of the slogans, the faces, the children held up as symbols for agendas they can't even understand. It's not new. It's medieval. It's tactical. And most never see it because they're too afraid to question the story they've been told. But you're not most people. You're still here, still watching, still listening. So let me give you a truth that most historians fear to speak aloud. Isabel was a ghost long before she was a queen. She died the moment her will was severed from her body, the moment her identity was overwritten by duty, the moment her yes was forged by other people's power. And that's exactly what these systems want from you. Not your death, your hollowing out, your participation, your polite smile as you climb a ladder that leads to someone else's dream. The world you were born into has perfected this, mass submission, masked as civilization, and the few who resist, they're called unstable, disruptive, dangerous, just like Richard would have called anyone who dared question his marriage to a child. So I'll ask you again, quietly, directly, who would you be without the mask they gave you? By the time Isabel turned 10, she had mastered silence. Not peace, not happiness. Silence. The kind that isn't chosen but constructed. A survival instinct. A learned behavior. Every smile she gave in public was rehearsed. Every nod at court was calculated. She knew what pleased Richard. She knew what triggered the women who watched her every move. She learned to exist, not as herself, but as the version of herself that posed the least threat to power. But in private, she withered. She stopped speaking to servants. She stopped playing. Her letters to her family in France became shorter, colder, until they stopped entirely. Her governess wrote once, asking if she was allowed to send a birthday gift. The reply came not from Isabel, but from the crown. The queen requires nothing at this time. Do you understand what that means? The system had consumed her voice so completely, it now spoke for her. And now, ask yourself, how many people around you are living the same fate? How many men do you know who've grown quiet, not from peace, but from disillusionment? How many of your friends gave up on their dreams, not because they were impossible, but because they were taught to believe those dreams were childish? How many people around you walk through life wearing masks that fit too tightly, but fear what would happen if they ever took them off? This is what elite systems have mastered, not overt violence, but internalized defeat. The palace doesn't need to whip you when you've learned to police yourself. That's the final stage of control, when the prisoner holds the keys but no longer remembers how to use them. Isabel became a national icon. Her face was printed, painted, praised. But the real girl, lost, buried beneath the image. And that's the same fate these systems offer you today. A role, a title, a status. Something to aim for, but never something to be. Because if you become you, truly, you become dangerous, unpredictable, uncontrollable. And control is the one thing the architects of this world refuse to surrender. But listen closely. Your memory is stronger than their programming. Every moment you've doubted the path, every time you've felt the weight of a life that isn't yours, that is your signal. That is your soul knocking from the inside saying, wake up, before they finish the ritual. Ritual. That's the word you need to hold on to now. Because what happened to Isabel wasn't just history, it was ceremony, a blueprint, a spell cast through repetition, generation after generation. The child is stripped, rebranded, displayed, crowned, owned, and then they call it destiny. Isabel's wedding was not the beginning of her reign, it was the end of her personhood. And every feast, every portrait, every whispered praise from courtiers was part of the same ritual magic, the erasure of will through admiration. That's how control disguises itself, not in chains, but in compliments, in titles, in applause so loud it drowns out your own thoughts. And here's where it turns toward you. You've been through your own rituals, haven't you? Graduation robes, national anthems, job titles, performance reviews, likes, shares, promotions, subscriptions, praise metrics, all these little ceremonies designed to reinforce he mask. Everyone a tiny reward for staying within the lines, for staying small, for obeying. But here's the cost they never tell you. Obedience does not lead to freedom. It leads to forgetfulness. And forgetfulness is the true currency of power. Because when you forget who you were before the programming, you become programmable. That's what happened to Isabel. And she was royal. She had armies, titles, wealth beyond imagination. And still, she couldn't escape the ritual. Because the real prison wasn't around her. It was inside her. That's the most terrifying part, isn't it? That they don't need to lock you up if they can just convince you to hold the gate closed yourself. And so I ask you now, not rhetorically, but directly. What rituals have you accepted without question? Which roles are you still performing just to be accepted by people who wouldn't recognize your soul if it stood right in front of them? How many times have you smiled because it was expected when you should have roared? We don't study dark history for drama. We study it because the same darkness adapts, learns, evolves. What once wore a crown now wears a logo. What once carried a scepter now holds a screen. And what once happened in castles now happens in algorithms, families, institutions. Everywhere the ritual continues. But if you can name it, you can break it. There's a reason they teach you history is something dead, something finished. A collection of names, dates, treaties. Because if you ever realized the rituals never ended, you'd start to question everything you've been told is normal. And that kind of awareness, that's a threat more dangerous than rebellion. Let me show you. Years passed. Richard II's power crumbled. His paranoia became prophecy. The nobles he tried to silence rose against him. The alliance with France, bought at the cost of a child bride, collapsed under its own hypocrisy. And when Richard was finally overthrown in 1399, what happened to Isabel? Nothing noble, nothing dignified. At 10 years old, she was abandoned, stripped of status, separated from the court, held under house arrest in a foreign land. No one came to her defense, not the priests who blessed her wedding, not the lords who once toasted her health, not even her mother, who now considered her a failed investment. She was a political ghost, too young to be useful, too inconvenient to protect. That's how systems treat you when you're no longer profitable. They discard you. Sound familiar? It happens today. In jobs, in politics, in relationships, in trends. Obey the script, and you'll be rewarded. Question it, or worse, outlive your usefulness, and you'll be cast into silence. Labeled as unstable, difficult, disposable. The truth is, every system built on domination carries this expiration date. It will praise you until you believe your value comes from it. Then it will watch you fall, unmoved. Because power doesn't love you, it feeds on you. And still, Isabel survived. Why? Because even when she was stripped of everything, her crown, her titles, her identity, something inside her refused to die. A flicker, a memory, a self she hadn't entirely forgotten. And in that flicker was a dangerous possibility that she was never truly theirs. That pause, and this is the part they never wanted you to hear. You can wear the mask and still dismantle the system from the inside. You can walk through the rituals and still carry your rebellion quietly in your chest. You can survive the programming if you never forget that it is programming. Isabel wasn't free, not fully, but she remembered enough to resist, enough to protect pieces of herself. And in a world designed to erase every last trace of your sovereignty, remembering is an act of war. So now I ask you, what pieces of yourself have you hidden away? What instincts did they train you to ignore? What fire did they shame you into smothering? What truth did you learn to apologize for before you ever spoke it? Because the only thing more dangerous than a system of control is someone who sees through it and keeps walking anyway. The architects of power fear one thing above all, a man who remembers. Not facts, not trivia, but truth. Raw, unfiltered, ancestral truth. The kind that pulses beneath your skin when you stare too long at the life they built for you and realize it was never yours to begin with. That was Isabel's quiet revolution. She didn't lead armies, she didn't shatter thrones, but she remembered. And that act, That refusal to let the ritual finish its work is what makes her story so dangerous, so threatening, so buried. They don't want you to see her survival as resistance. They want you to see her as broken, defeated, erased. Because if you ever understood that even in captivity she found pieces of herself too sacred to surrender, you might begin to dig for your own. You might start to question the rituals in your life, the job you hate but perform for approval, the beliefs you parrot to keep peace in conversations. The family roles, the church traditions, the hollow celebrations that no longer fit, but still bind. You might start asking, what am I still obeying out of habit, not choice? And that question, it's a blade, sharp, personal, revolutionary, because every man who dares to ask it threatens the system, not with protest, but with withdrawal, with silence, with refusal. You don't have to burn down the palace, you just have to stop kneeling before it. Let me be clear, they're not afraid of violence, they're afraid of awareness. Violence they can contain. Awareness spreads. It speaks in quiet moments, in late nights, in long stares at the ceiling, in that feeling in your gut that says, this isn't it. This isn't what I was made for. You were not born to obey. You were not born to smile through hollow rituals, to chase dead kings' dreams, to live a history that erases your name before it begins. You were born to remember, to awaken, to rise. And the moment you do, the spell begins to break, not just for you, but for every man who sees you walking in truth. That is how awakening spreads, not like fire, like contagion. Let's strip away the illusion entirely now. You've seen the ceremony, you've felt the cage. Now we step into the marrow of it, the forbidden truth behind every system of domination. You were never powerless. They just needed you to believe you were. From the moment you were born, they surrounded you with stories, not just fairy tales, but social contracts disguised as facts. This is how life works. This is what success looks like. This is the kind of man you're allowed to become. And beneath every lesson, every rule, every silent punishment was the same hidden message. Stay small, stay quiet, stay predictable. Because a predictable man is a controlled man, and a controlled man, he's no threat. He'll work their jobs, pay their taxes, raise his children to obey the same ghosts that haunted him. He'll die proud of the cage, never realizing he built it himself. That's what they wanted from Isabel. But here's the fracture they didn't plan for. Memory is persistent, and pain, when it doesn't kill you, becomes fuel. Isabel's silence became observation. Her trauma became discernment. She could see the rituals for what they were. She didn't run. She endured. But she stopped playing their game. And though they forced her into another marriage, though they tried to erase her will with new names and titles, they never got her back. This is the threshold you now face. You've seen the machine. You've traced its gears back to their roots in palaces and pulpits. You know now that the myth of control, be it through crowns, flags, or screens, is just that. A myth. A costume for fear. Their fear. Because deep down, they know what happens when even one man walks away from the script. He becomes unpredictable. He becomes magnetic. He becomes a mirror. And when others look into him, they see what they've forgotten. You are that man now, not someday, not when you've read more books or how healed every wound. Now, The very fact that you're still watching, still breathing, still feeling means the ritual didn't finish its work on you. You are the glitch in the system, the refusal, the return. And every step you take from here is not rebellion, it's remembrance. So here we are, at the edge of the labyrinth. You've seen how the spell is cast, how innocence is sculpted into obedience, how every institution that pretends to serve you was engineered to shape you. But now, let's turn the blade around. Let's ask the question they fear most. What happens when a man no longer fears the collapse of the story? What happens when you stop clinging to your assigned name, your controlled path, your curated purpose, and stand naked before the raw truth that none of it was ever yours? That's not despair. That's freedom. Because everything they gave you was built on one foundational lie. You need them. You need their systems, their approval, their stages, their masks. But what they've hidden, buried beneath centuries of fear, is that you were born with everything you needed to burn the whole narrative down. Not with fire, but with awareness, with choice, with ungovernable presence. Isabel, at 12, watched her second husband die in war. She was widowed before she had even become a teenager. And in that moment, for the first time in her life, no one knew what to do with her. There were no scripts for a girl who'd outlived 2 kings and refused to bend again. They tried to silence her, send her to a convent, remarry her, hide her away. But this time, she resisted, fiercely, publicly. She wrote letters, defied protocol, demanded her own household, refused to be used again as a tool of treaty. She wasn't just surviving anymore. She was reclaiming. And if a 12-year-old girl, groomed by kingdoms, surrounded by enemies, buried under crowns not of her choosing, could do that, then what excuse do you have? You who know the machine. You who've seen its gears and masks and blood-stained scripts. You who've walked through your own betrayals, losses, failures, and still find yourself breathing, aware, watching. You are not too broken. You are not too late. You are not too small. The only question that matters now is this: will you leave the cage, even if the door has always been open? Because if you do, if you walk out not with anger but with clarity, you don't just escape. You become the thing they cannot contain. This is the final chamber, the deepest part of the descent. And you already know, once truth is seen, it can't be unseen. The man who walks out of this will never fit back into the life that brought him here. Not because he's changed, but because he's remembered. Remembered that every mask was chosen, every silence trained, every cage disguised as duty. And now that you've seen the rituals for what they are, you can't pretend they're sacred anymore. Let them keep their crowns. Let them choke on the scripts they worship. Because you, now, are something they cannot define. Not a follower, not a rebel, but a man who has awakened. Isabel died young, just 19, her body broken by stress, childbirth, exile. But her spirit, that's what made her dangerous. Because even in death, the documents survive. The letters, the refusals, the quiet moments where she chose herself, in a world that never wanted her to even realize she had that option. That's your inheritance now. Not victimhood, not grief, but the seed of revolt that begins not with violence, but with vision. When you walk out into the world after this video, it'll all still be there. The roles, the algorithms, the eyes watching to see if you'll fall back into line. You will be tempted, you may even stumble, but you won't forget. Because inside you now is a scar and a map. A scar from the life they tried to give you, and a map toward the one they never wanted you to find. So here's what I want from you. Not for me, not for the algorithm, but for you. Type it again. One last time. Not just in the comments, but like an oath, like blood on stone. I see the crown in the cage. I see the crown in the cage. Because that crown, that's yours. And the cage, it was never locked. Walk, and never look back.